So today we're using the mind as the object of Shamatha practice. Many of you probably find this much more challenging than focusing on the breath. The breath, of course, is a physical, tangible object, whereas the mind is not some physical, tangible object, so often difficult to focus on it. And also, we don't tend to have a habit of observing our thoughts and emotions and so forth. But there are enormous benefits for doing this practice, particularly for us in our modern society. Because many of us in the modern world are tormented by our own minds. We get caught up in a lot of obsessive, compulsive thinking. And often we get overwhelmed by our thoughts, emotions and memories. And so we end up being the slaves of our mind. We've made our mind our worst enemy. With this practice, we'll become the masters of our own mind instead of being the slaves. Because every time a thought, emotion, memory comes up, now what we tend to do is one of two things. Either we follow it, get caught up in our stories, and of course every time we do that, we're increasing the habit of all this stuff coming up in our mind. And the other thing we do now is, if it's unpleasant, the thought, emotion, memory is unpleasant, and we don't know what to do with it, then we try and suppress it. And that doesn't deal with it, of course. All that happens is that often then manifests as a lot of physical problems in the body, and then we project a lot of this negativity onto the people around us. So we really are the slaves of our own mind. Doing this practice, we'll become the masters of our own mind. Because here in this practice we're simply observing thoughts, emotions, memories and so on as they arise and pass. Without following them, without trying to suppress them. And of course every time we manage to observe a thought, emotion, memory arise and pass, we're not feeding it. Which means the habit of them coming up will get weaker and weaker and weaker. Which means over time our mind will naturally become more quiet and still. So we don't need to try and make our mind still. In fact, that doesn't work. If we try to make our mind still, we're fighting with the mind. It just agitates the mind more. All we need to do is step back and watch and allow the mind to settle. A little bit like the analogy that's sometimes given of if you have a container with water and a lot of sediment in there and it's all stirred up, then it's very unclear, murky. To make it clear, if you try and force it to be clear, it just stirs it up more. So all you need to do is put it down and let it rest, and then that sediment sinks to the bottom. So likewise, if we just sit back and rest and just watch, the mental afflictions subside, or the thoughts and emotions and so forth subside. So our mind will naturally become more quiet and still. But also, if we develop this habit of being able to observe thoughts and emotions and so forth arise and pass, it means that in future, if some strong mental event were to arise, we could simply be present with it without it overwhelming us. Because if we look at what a thought, emotion or memory is from its own side, it's virtually nothing. They're virtually nothing. They have no power in themselves to harm us. Thoughts, emotions, memories and so forth only have power to harm us if we give them power. And we give them power either by identifying with them and following them or trying to suppress them. Then they have a lot of power to harm us. But if we can simply step back and watch and observe them arise and pass, they have no power to harm us. So we really will become the masters of our mind through doing this practice. And another benefit with this practice, of course, is that by observing our mind and these mental events, we can start to intuitively get an insight into the very nature of our mind and our thoughts and emotions, which of course is Vipassana practice. So this practice is also quite well known as a bridge into the Vipassana practice. So, but of course, for this practice, we want to let go of any unrealistic expectations. And again, not expect that we'll be able to do this quite well, that, you know, I think I can watch my thoughts and emotions, that's not too difficult. But of course, when we sit down and we try and do that, then we find